Thomas Reed lived in Portland, Maine, a weathered town of lobster traps and salt-crusted docks, where the Atlantic churned gray and restless, and he spent 31 years married to Diane. At 55, in the thick fog of July 2021, he untied himself, not with a burst of anger, but with a heavy, deliberate breath, a choice to escape a life that had run aground. They'd raised a son named Ethan, lived in a clapboard cottage perched on a bluff above the harbor, and stitched together a world shaped by the tides and the rhythms of a coastal existence. He worked as a marine mechanic, his hands rough and oil-stained from years of coaxing engines back to life, while she ran a bakery downtown, her fingers deft with dough, her days sweetened by the scent of yeast and sugar. By his early 50s, that world had drifted into a fog of routine, their bond frayed like a rope worn thin by the sea. This is Thomas's story, a departure from a harbor grown still, a journey through choppy waves, and a rediscovery of purpose under a wide sky after 55, set against the raw, briny edge of America's Northeast. Thomas met Diane in the humid haze of August 1989 at a clam shack on Commercial Street, a gritty strip where fishermen swapped tails and gulls screamed overhead. He was 24, leaning against a picnic table in a grease-streaked jacket, nursing a lukewarm beer after a long day wrestling with a boat's busted propeller. She stood by the counter, 24 and sun-kissed, her apron dusted with flour from a morning shift at a bakery 2 blocks away, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun that caught the late light. They talked about the harbor's ceaseless pulse, about his love for the roar of a motor firing up, about her skill at turning flour and water into crusty loaves that warmed the belly. He asked her out as the sun dipped below the wharf, the sky streaking orange and pink, and she nodded with a smile that felt like a breeze off the water. A year later, in August 1990, they married on a windswept beach near Cape Elizabeth, her dress billowing like a sail, his boots sinking into wet sand, the Portland headlight beaming in the distance as friends raised cans of beer and shouted over the surf. He promised to keep their ship steady, she vowed to fill it with comfort. For a long stretch, they navigated that pact. Their son, Ethan, came in the damp spring of 1993, a wiry, squalling boy with Thomas's broad shoulders and Diane's quick, crooked smile. Thomas swapped greasy late nights in the garage for early evenings on the wharf, teaching Ethan to cast a line, the boy's small hands gripping a rod as they fished for mackerel, their laughter tangling with the slap of waves against pilings. Diane turned their cottage into a refuge, blue gingham curtains swaying in the kitchen, a wood stove crackling in the corner, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon rolls or fresh sourdough on snowy mornings when the harbor iced over. In 1996, they scraped together savings and bought the place, a clapboard house. With peeling white paint, a slanted roof that groaned in storms, a rickety porch overlooking the working boats of Casco Bay, and a shed out back cluttered with wrenches and spare parts. Thomas patched the walls with cedar planks, rebuilt the porch steps with lumber salvaged from a wrecked dock, his hammer echoing into the dusk. Diane planted herbs in clay pots, basil, thyme, rosemary, lining the railing with green bursts, her hands earthy as she tended them between bakery shifts. They'd walked the eastern promenade as a family, Ethan racing ahead to chase gulls, the sea sprawling vast and wild before them, its horizon of promise they couldn't name. Money ebbed and flowed like the tide, storms rattled the windows, but the cottage held them fast, sturdy, flawed, theirs. The drift crept in slow, a current pulling beneath the surface. By his 40s, Thomas felt the moorings loosen. Ethan left for Boston in 2012, studying marine biology at BU, his bedroom a shrine of fishing rods, faded Red Sox caps, and a cracked tackle box he'd painted as a kid. The cottage hushed, its creaks and groans louder than voices, the wood stove cold more often than not. Diane stretched her hours at the bakery, kneading dough for summer tourists or rolling pastries for the holiday rush, her chatter fading to tired murmurs when she trudged through the door, her apron still tied, her hands smelling of butter and vanilla. Thomas stayed late at the docks, his back stiff from hauling crankshafts and fuel pumps, his evenings spent alone in the shed, hunched over an outboard, the hum of machinery drowning out the silence of the house. He'd reach out, let's sail to Peaks Island, take the day, or, how about supper at Eventide, oysters, and all, but she'd shrug, her eyes on a recipe card or the TV, muttering, too tired, Tom, maybe next time. They ate apart, him with a sandwich on the porch, her with leftovers in the kitchen, their forks scraping plates in separate orbits. By 2019, he claimed the couch, its springs jabbing his ribs, the sea's restless murmur through the window a song he couldn't trust. The break rolled in with the fog in July 2021. Thomas was 55, his hands scarred and knotted from decades of wrenches and wire, his hair thinning beneath a faded cap he wore against the sun's glare. He just revived a trawler's diesel engine, its growl a small victory after hours of sweat, when he drove home through a mist so dense it swallowed the road, the lighthouse's beam of faint pulse in the gray. Diane sat on the porch, a mug of coffee gone cold in her hands, her eyes fixed on the harbor's shifting shadows, her apron crumpled beside her. "We've got to face it," he said, his voice rough as the gravel under his boots. She turned, her face lined from years of early rises, her blonde hair streaked with gray. "Face what, Tom?" "Us, we're not us anymore, haven't been for years." She nodded, slow and heavy, her breath a white puff in the damp air. "You're right, I feel it too, I've felt it a long time." They sat there, the fog wrapping them like a shroud, the creak of the porch swing the only sound as they agreed 31 years was enough to call it. No shouting matches, no flung accusations, just a boat that had run hard aground, too battered to refloat. Divorce at 55 hit like a nor'easter. They sold the cottage, too worn by salt and memory, and split the money down the middle, a clean cut through decades. Diane moved to a one-bedroom apartment near her bakery on 4th Street, surrounded by the clatter of ovens and the comfort of familiar routines. Thomas rented a room above a bait shop on the wharf, a cramped space with thin walls, a single window rattling with every gust, the air thick with the tang of fish and diesel. Ethan, now 28 and working at a lab in Boston, called him, his voice tight. "Dad, why'd you let it sink like this, why now?" Thomas stumbled. "I didn't let it sink, son, it drifted off course and I couldn't haul it back." Friends split like driftwood, some stayed with Diane, crowding her counter for scones and gossip, others met him for beers at Gritty McDuff's, their voices low with sympathy or stilted cheer. The first year was a slog through mud. He worked the docks in a haze, fixing boats with hands that trembled, his nights spent pacing the wharf, boots scuffing the planks, the sea's roar a taunt in his ears. He missed Ethan's thumping steps on the stairs, Diane's humming over the stove, the cottage's groan against the wind. Sleep came in fits, the room's damp chill a weight on his chest, the cries of gulls piercing his dreams. A wind shifted in the summer of 2022. At 56, Thomas saw a weathered sign at the Marina Portland Sailing Club, Saturdays, all welcome, and joined on a whim, a spark lit by years around boats he'd never captained. His hands, used to bolts and gaskets, fumbled with ropes and sails at first, his balance shaky on the deck of a borrowed sloop. The group was a rough mix, retirees with sea-weathered faces, a young deckhand with quick hands, a widow named Beth who trimmed a jib with a quiet, steady grace. They met weekly, cutting through Casco Bay, the wind sharpened their hair, the waves slapping the hull with a rhythm that woke him. Thomas learned tacking against the breeze, steering by the stars, his shoulders easing into the pull of the lines. He bought a used dinghy, a 12-foot skiff with peeling blue paint and a patched sail, and took it out solo one dawn, the harbor waking in a blaze of gold around him as he navigated past the breakwater. It wasn't fast, wasn't sleek, but it moved, a small boat, a big step. By 57, Thomas was charting a fresh course. He sold his rusted truck, bought a bike, a sturdy black frame with a rack for gear, and pedaled the coast, from the sandy stretch of Old Orchard Beach to the jagged cliffs of Two Lights, the salt air stinging his lungs, the crash of surf a pulse in his veins. He wasn't swift, tourists on rentals passed him, kids laughed from the boardwalk, but speed wasn't the goal, the ride was, the horizon stretching wide and unbroken before him. He started a log, wharf notes, scribbling in a battered notebook about boats he'd fixed, the divorce that broke him, the sea that pulled him back, his words raw and jagged like the rocks offshore. Dock workers found it first, passing it around over coffee, then strangers stumbled in, readers from Bangor, Portland, a fisherman in Bar Harbor writing, "I'm out there too, keep it up." Ethan drove up one weekend, saw the dinghy tied to the pier, its sail fluttering, and clapped him on the back. "You're a captain now, Dad, damn proud of you." Beth from the club invited him to a lobster bake on Long Island. He went, cracking claws under a sky streaked with stars, the fire's crackle and the sea song sinking deep into his bones. At 58, Thomas sailed steady and strong. He cut back hours at the shop, took a job at the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, guiding kids and tourists through exhibits, knots tied by sailors long gone, charts of routes to Nova Scotia, tales of schooners that braved storms and returned. He biked to Monhegan Island one bright summer weekend, sailed his dinghy around its sheer cliffs, slept on the deck under a sky so thick with stars it felt like a blanket. He wasn't flush, his room above the bait shop smelled of fish and low tide, his bike creaked on steep hills, his savings stayed lean from years of patching boats. He wasn't a name, his log had 350 readers, mostly locals and a few sailors, his dinghy stayed small and simple. But he was Thomas, loose, alive, at peace with the wind and the waves. Diane remarried in 2024, a baker from her shop with a laugh like hers once was. He tipped his cap across the distance, she'd docked her life, he'd set his sails. Divorce at 55 cut me adrift, he writes now, his hand steady on the page, ink smudging from the salt on his fingers. It gave me the wind to find my way. Across America, from Portland's rocky shores to every windswept coast, people like Thomas leave harbors every day. Gray divorces aren't wrecks, they're launches. I'm Jordan Lane, and this is Gray Divorce Diaries. Thomas's tale is real, wild, worn, wondrous. If it stirs the sea in you, subscribe. Every day, a new story, people like us, sailing anew after 55. You're not alone. Let's catch your wind together.